3, verses 11 through 17. The title, Let's Review, and More on Love. So before we dive into the next set of verses, let's take a moment to review what we know about what John has told us to this point. Remember a time or so ago, we talked about the fact that John introduces a topic very briefly, says something about it, then he goes on to introduce other topics, and then at some point he'll come back to earlier topics as he moves forward. In a sense, it looks very unstructured, but he is actually moving forward. Whenever he returns to a topic, he generally does one of two things. He either adds something additional, which, of course, if you add it is additional, right? I think a mathematician would know better. He generally adds something to his previous work, or if not, he will use different words to explain his notions. Hoping, of course, that by saying it 2 or 3 different ways, you will get the point sooner or later. One of them will click with you. The breakdown to date, as I see it, can be described as 3 tests, or 3 walks of life, or 3 areas of evidence for true salvation. And that's what John's trying to do. He's trying to say, you know, that if you want to prove to me that you have a true salvation, you are truly saved, I want to see it. And I'm going to call it something like this: the 3, the walk of truth, the walk of obedience, and the walk of love. Or you could say the test of truth, the test of obedience, the test of love. You know, a number of different ways one could say it. So first I want to take a look at the walk of truth. In chapter 1, verses 5, 6, and 7, John contrasted light and darkness. And that's really a contrast between truth and error, because the light is the light of God. Darkness is that which is not of God and would represent error. In that discussion, John spoke of checking your words and claims against your life. What's your life look like? You say this, you make a claim of that, you say this is true. He says, I want to look at your life and see if I believe that that's correct. Consistency between word and deed when it comes to walking with God is one evidence that supports a claim of an honest salvation. I'm trying to think. I'm trying to find substitute words. In honest salvation, is there such a thing as a dishonest salvation? I'm not sure where that would come in. Anyhow, inconsistency actually challenges any claim you make to salvation and fellowship with God. So we're looking for consistency in walk. This test could also be called the test of righteousness or the test of right living. That is, living according to God's code, God's directions. In other words, the consistent practice of right living is strong evidence that your salvation is truly salvation of God. Well, closely associated with that test is the test of obedience. It's hard to separate these two. I'm not bold enough to try, I guess. Again, John clearly stated that obedience to Christ's commands is one more powerful evidence that your salvation is true. And he speaks of that in chapter 2, verses 3, 4, 5, and 6. And there he's talking about habitual behavior again. Habitual, willing disobedience, for example, is a powerful testimony against having salvation. Doing what is right reflects obedience and suggests a saved state of affairs. That's seen in chapter 2, verse 29. But if you walk without habitual, intentional sin, there's another sign that's consistent with a bona fide salvation. And John points that out in chapter 3, verse 4. Now, included in the mix between walking in truth and walking in obedience is the notion of perseverance or abiding or remaining. John spoke of this in chapter 2, verses 19 through 24, when he was discussing the spirit of Antichrist. Remember, he said, there is an Antichrist who's coming. There are already Antichrists who are really those who show the spirit of Antichrist, not that they are the Antichrist. But in that conversation, he spoke of this notion of perseverance, abiding, remaining. Persevering in the faith and in the truth of Jesus Christ adds power to a testimony of your belief. However, denial of Jesus in his being, God, man, in his life, sinless or not, or his purpose for coming to save people who will believe in him. So if you deny any of those things about Jesus, that becomes a testimony of unbelief, not a testimony of true belief. So walking away from the faith is evidence for apostasy, not salvation. And recall that that's where John went with that. He said, they walked out on us, away from us, started their own religion, and they did it so that we would know they weren't one of us. They were not saved. And so finally, we come to the test of love. And he begins that in chapter 2, verses 7 through 11. He contrasted love and hate of the brethren particularly. Love and hate generally, love and hate of the brethren specifically. One supports the claim of salvation, the love of the brethren. The other argues for a disconnect, and that's the hate of the brethren. In verse 15 of chapter 2, he expanded the test of love in a negative way. You remember what it was? He said, love of the world precludes loving God. You cannot love both the world and God. Those two cannot coexist. You love the world, you do not love God. You love God, you will not love the things of the world. Love of the world argues against any claim to salvation. So again, John is just saying, I want to look at your life, and I'll tell you whether you are living up according to what you claim or not. If you're not, I have to doubt your claim. If you are, I probably will accept your claim. God's love, and that preceded any individual's love of him, includes being adopted into his family as a child of God. Well, we think about believers being children of God, child of God, and that's true. But there's something additional in the notion of adoption. I didn't know this. My wife learned it and told me about it. In that culture, in biblical times in the Middle East, a father could disinherit his natural born son, but he could not disinherit an adopted son. What does that say? Once adopted, a child of God cannot lose his or her eternal inheritance. In other words, once God adopts you, you've got eternal life. End of story. Well, end of that argument, anyhow. It's not the end of the story, because the story truly begins, of course, in eternity future. But after he'd done that, John added the idea that there are only two families of children. It's not hard. Jesus did the same thing. Remember, the Pharisees were giving him a hard time and saying he was a Samaritan or he was insane, all kinds of things. And he said, you are children of the devil. So the two families of children, children of Satan, children of God. And John made it clear, chapter 3, verse 10, that it's relatively easy to distinguish children of Satan from children of God. Who does live righteously? Whose lifestyle reflects basically right living? Not that we never sin as believers, but our general trend is to live according to God's commands. In the last session, we added to the walk in truth, that is, the walk in righteousness, the walk in holiness, the walk in which you do right, live right, those sorts of things. And John spoke of a life of doing what is right. So what's he going to do in this next section of verses that we're going to open up in a minute? Well, he's going to return to the test of love, and he's going to expand our understanding of it. And he's going to begin by giving us 3 traits of those who fail the test. And of course, what he's doing here is asking him to look at those teachers that he considers false teachers. But keep in mind, these tests are not requirements to earn salvation. You don't earn salvation. They are simply ways of telling whether a person's life reflects consistency with his claims. There are life traits that one reasonably expects to find in the life of a true believer. Let's look at 1 John chapter 3, verse 11. We're going to look at verses 11 through 17. And then we will continue that after these first 7 verses. John goes on and talks more even about the test of love. Here's verse 11. For this is a message which you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. Does that from the beginning sound familiar? Well, it should. Go back to 1 John 1:1. What was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we beheld and our hands handled concerning the word of life. Chapter 2, verse 7. Beloved, I'm not writing a new commandment to you, but an old commandment which you have had from the beginning. The old commandment is the word which you have heard. And in verse 24 of chapter 2, as for you, let that abide in you which you heard from the beginning. If what you heard from the beginning abides in you, you will also abide in the Son and in the Father. So the beginning, of course, was either when the apostles first taught it, or it was when the group of people to whom John's writing first heard of it and learned of it. But John gave examples of Satan's children coming up short in the matter of love. Remember, we said there are going to be 3 exhibits in the sense of showing 3 ways in which Satan's children fail to live up to the test of love. First one's in verse 12, where he was talking about love, but in verse 11, but he says, not as Cain, who was of the evil one. There's a child of Satan. Cain was a child of Satan, and slew his brother. And for what reason did he slay him? Because that was Cain's deeds were evil, and his brother's, Abel's, were righteous. So why did Cain kill Abel? By the way, the word for kill in the Greek is sphazo. I guess that's how you pronounce it. Sphazo when it's put into the Roman alphabet. It means to butcher or to slaughter. So essentially that verse could be translated that Cain butchered Abel or that Cain slaughtered Abel. Well, so why did he do it? Well, apparently because Abel lived within God's approved order. But Cain chose his own way. Those of you who have been with us since we studied Jude would remember that Jude mentioned Cain also as an example of someone who goes their own way and ignores God. So Cain chose his own way, and that way was outside God's approval. Can you think of anybody else in Scripture who touted man's way above God's way and killed someone who had God's total approval? How about it, Jeff? I suspect you got this one. The most obvious one, to me at least, were the religious elite who had Christ killed. Why did they have Christ killed? Because he followed God's plan perfectly and was a threat to their position, their influence. Whose? Those who were in the elite religious circles. He was a threat to everything they held dear. And remember, the Pharisees in particular, Christ accused on more than one occasion of supporting man's traditions above God's way, which is essentially the mark of Cain. Verse 13, do not marvel, brethren, if the world hates you. You can read of many who paid this ultimate price for their faith. The death or martyrdom or persecution of Christians, that was not an isolated event. In either Cain's case or, just being killed like Abel or by being killed like Jesus is not an isolated event. You want to look up a few? Look into the Hall of Faith in Hebrews 11, particularly verses beginning with verse 35. Or how about Stephen in Acts 7, where he was giving a defense of his gospel and was stoned to death for it? Or how about Paul's treatment on his missionary journeys, where he was bad-mouthed, put in prison, stoned, shipwrecked? Or what about the many Christians today who are still being martyred because of all those who hate Christianity? No, Cain and later the Pharisees are not isolated examples of those who hate those who follow God closely and live according to God's principles. John extends the charge against the false teachers. That's what he's been doing this whole time. And he talks about their second characteristic. They do not love, but rather they hate believers. They hate the brethren. Look at verses 14 and 15 of chapter 3. We know that we have passed out of death into life. We know we've been saved because we love the brethren. There he's saying the love of the brethren is a strong indicator that you in fact are saved. However, and he goes on, he who does not love abides in death. There's your false teachers. There are your apostates. There are your unbelievers. Everyone who hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. That means no murderer who does not come to Christ and change his ways so that he is no longer a murderer, he is unsaved. So, from murder to hatred. Big step? No. Remember, Christ in the Sermon on the Mount said there's a connection between hatred and murder. Hatred is the motivator for murder. Cain was a murderer, but these false teachers that John's talking about hated believers, which means they could easily end up in murder, and spiritually that's as bad as the physical act of murder. But the Christian's behavior, by comparison, is just to be the opposite. Verse 16, we know love by this, that he, Jesus, laid down his life for us, and we ought to, and I'm adding a couple words here, we ought to mimic him and lay down our lives for the brethren. That doesn't necessarily mean, of course, you're going to physically die to save one of the brothers or sisters, although that could happen. He's talking about a life of sacrifice where you love the brethren enough to be willing to give up your own comfort, your own time, your own energies, your own material goods to make sure that the brethren are supplied with things they need to be supplied with. Then John gives a third example of the behaviors. The first is murder, the second is hate of the brethren. Now here's the third example in verse 17, the last verse that we'll look at from 1 John. But whoever has the world's goods and beholds his brother in need and closes his heart against him, how does the love of God abide in him? Rhetorical question, of course. The answer is it doesn't. At least that's no display of that love. As I said, without a doubt, that's a rhetorical question. The love of God doesn't reside in a person who has no concern, no compassion for a person in need, a person who's hurting. No compassion or concern for the welfare of believers. James, if you recall, most of you will, made a very similar statement, making a different kind of argument, but essentially the same idea. James 2, verses 15, 16, and 17. If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you, that's one of the so-called believers, one of you claims to be a believer, and one of you says to them, the ones in need, go in peace, be warmed and be filled, and yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is that? What good is your statement, go in peace, warm and be filled, if you don't do anything to help? Verse 17, but whoever has the world's goods and beholds his brother in need and closes his heart against him, how does the love of God abide in him? Same question, rhetorical. It doesn't. But this is not the end of John's expansion on the test of love. We'll look at it further in next session. He's going to do something different in the next session. He's going to begin to talk directly to the congregation, the believers that he knows have come under the influence of these false teachers. He's going to admonish them in case they're looking and losing some of their love for the brethren because of the influence of the false teachers, and then he's going to encourage them as well. So what are some takeaways? Well, the first one, again, are John's points. John's making these points. Knowledge of God, intimate knowledge of God, is tested by examining conduct. Are you walking in the light of God's truth? Second point, being born of God is tested by whether you have a life of doing what is right and being obedient. The third point, being born of God, is also tested by the examination of your love for the the brethren. Is it there or is it not? You need a positive response in all three of those situations. Now, John's been leveling charges against the heretical teachers, as we said. But next time, we're about to see him direct his words to the community of faith, those that have been under the influence of the teachers, trying to correct any slacking off in the love area, and then to encourage. So there are two major areas that have been tested. Walking in the light, God is light. Are you walking in love? God is love. So I'll end with this question. Do I walk according to who your God is? Or do I walk according to who my God is? We'll see you next time, prayerfully.